This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm Oliver Conway, and we're recording this at 14 hours GMT on Tuesday, the 27th of November. Our main stories. The French president outlines a radical strategy to eliminate fossil fuels, but says he won't give in to violent demands from protesters to scrap new taxes. The British Prime Minister dismisses comments by President Trump that her Brexit plan will stop Britain expanding trade with the US. And a Syrian man who spent months living in a Malaysian airport has arrived in Canada after being granted asylum. Also in this podcast, Russia releases footage showing an apparent confession from Ukrainian sailors captured by Russian forces. NATO says Moscow must release them.
We call on Russia to immediately release the personnel and the ships and allow free access for Ukrainian ships through the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait.
President Trump rejects the findings of his own government report on the cost of climate change, and the sleeping pilot who overshot his destination by 50 kilometres. For the past 2 weekends, France has been engulfed in what the president called battle scenes, as tens of thousands of people took to the streets to demand a repeal of new taxes on petrol and diesel, sparking clashes with police. Today, Emmanuel Macron addressed the issue during a speech about how to reduce the French reliance on fossil fuels.
Je veux ici dire que je ne confonds pas.
I want to say here that I do not confuse these unacceptable acts with the demonstrations on which they're riding. I do not confuse the destroyers with fellow citizens who are just sending a message. I feel understanding for these fellow citizens, but I will not give anything up to those who want destruction and disorder.
Our Paris correspondent Hugh Schofield told me more about President Macron's message.
He said he understood why they felt that they were the big victims of the transition to cleaner energy. Let's remind ourselves these protesters come from all the way around the country, mainly in sort of peri-urban areas, if you like, rather than the middle of town. That people who use their cars an awful lot, and they feel that they're being victimised because they're regarded as inconsequential types who live in the middle of nowhere and being made to pay the price for this transition to cleaner energy, because basically a key part of that policy is a rise in fuel tax, which they bear the brunt of. He said he understood that, but he's not going to move from the overriding priority for France, which is to make the transition to cleaner energy, and that means moving to non-fossil fuel cars over the next 20, 30 years. What he said was sympathetic in a sense, but there were no really big measures that I think will satisfy them. The only thing that might help a certain amount is that he said that this carbon tax, the tax on fuel, will be adjustable so that if there's a big increase in the price on the world market, the full level of the tax won't kick in, or it'll be reduced. That, I suppose, will go some way to helping the protesters, but otherwise he was promising a change of method, more consultation. You receive the leaders of the protesters and so on. Not, I would imagine, the kind of stuff which is going to really satisfy them.
Well, what did he say about where France will get its energy from? Because he's also talking about shutting a lot of nuclear power stations.
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget that this speech was long programmed and was overtaken by events rather with the protests. So the original purpose was to spell out this transition. Again, I say 2050 is his goal for a totally decarbonised economy, as he put it. There'll be a big increase of investment in non-fossil fuels and the shutting of maybe 12, 13, 14 nuclear power reactors over the next 20 years. That's about a quarter of the country's full stock of nuclear power.
Hugh Schofield in Paris. As if the British Prime Minister Theresa May didn't have enough to worry about at home, now Donald Trump has joined the ranks of those criticising her Brexit plan. The US President said the agreement with the EU might scupper Britain's chances of a new trade deal with America.
Sounds like a great deal for the EU. I think we have to take a look at seriously whether or not the UK is allowed to trade, because, right now, if you look at the deal, they may not be able to trade with us.
The Prime Minister's office has insisted that the agreement does allow the UK to sign trade deals with other countries, including the US. But senior Conservative MP Michael Fallon said MPs couldn't ignore the warning from Mr Trump.
It's no use us brushing that off and saying, no, we can do a deal with America. He's the president of the United States, and if he says it's going to be difficult, then it certainly looks like it's going to be difficult. To do those trade deals successfully, we've got to be able to reduce the external tariff. That's the tariff on goods coming in to the United Kingdom. And it's clear from the documents that the rest of the European Union won't necessarily allow that unless it gets its way on a whole host of other things. They have the levers.
So is President Trump right to say that Britain may not be able to strike a bilateral free trade deal with America? A question for our political correspondent, Rob Watson.
He's sort of right and he's sort of wrong. He's sort of right in this broad way, and that is after Britain leaves the European Union, it's going to have a choice to make when it comes to goods, things like fridges, cars, all that kind of stuff. Does it want to be in the orbit of the United States in terms of regulation or the European Union? Because you have to understand there are only two regulatory superpowers, if I could put it that way, in the world, the US and the European Union. And this document implies, the political declaration, that Britain would want to stay closer to the European Union. And that, of course, makes sense in that the European Union is right on our doorstep. And, of course, that's what Canada does in terms of its relationship with the United States. But he's sort of wrong in the sense that what he was saying kind of implies that right now there isn't much trade between the US and the UK. I mean, that's just not true. The US takes 19% of UK exports in terms of worth. I mean, that's only second to the EU, which takes 44%.
But whether he's right or wrong, it's not an ideal time for Theresa May, this intervention coming as she tries to sell her deal to the public.
OK, it was a long answer to your first question, short answer to the second one. I'm sure in Downing Street the view is, with friends like Donald Trump, who needs enemies?
Yeah, I mean, do MPs listen to what Donald Trump will say? Will they?
Well, I think they would certainly listen on this trade issue. But, I mean, I think they would also think that maybe Donald Trump isn't the last word when it comes to trade. And some MPs, those who are well informed about trade, will understand what we've just been talking about are the kind of choices that that the UK will be facing. I mean, I think actually the bigger problem for Theresa May as we speak is not the Donald Trump intervention, unhelpful as that was, but that someone like Michael Fallon, for those listening who don't know him, I mean, he's normally an absolute arch loyalist to the Prime Minister. For him to be saying he's going to vote against this deal, that is very worrying for number 10 Downing Street.
Rob Watson. Some women say they do it because they enjoy being pregnant, others because they believe that every family has the right to have a child. With global infertility rates rising, the number of surrogate mothers is going up, women who volunteer to carry somebody else's baby in their womb. And Canada is a particular hotspot, with surrogacy rates rising by an estimated 400% over the past decade. The country is now debating changes in legislation to respond to the increasing demand for surrogacy, as the BBC's Valeria Parasso reports.
There we go. Marisa is delivering a baby that is not her own. She's a surrogate mother in Canada, where women have babies for strangers for free.
Oh, I love it. It's just crazy that she's out in the world now. I've just created a family. Like someone else's family.
A surrogate mother carries someone else's child. Canadian law gives that child and the couple who supplied the embryo to the surrogate rights. They are the legal parents. The surrogate simply gives away the baby at birth, and with it, any parental rights at all.
Hey, hot mama!
I first met Marisa earlier in her pregnancy at a surrogate's retreat.
My name is Marisa. I'm here because I am a surrogate. I'm 35 weeks pregnant with a little girl. Back in 2016, I was very down and low, and I just wanted to bring light. So my very good friend Kara, she knew I loved to be pregnant, and so she's like, why don't you try surrogacy? So I decided to sign on, and it went fairly quickly. It is two gentlemen that I'm having it for. It's their baby, it's not mine. I'm helping a family that wouldn't normally be a family, have a family. So I'm creating not just a child for these gentlemen, but I'm also creating a legacy.
Unlike what happens in many other countries, surrogacy in Canada is altruistic. It is legal as long as women do not get a financial gain out of it.
I would never do this as a job. I wouldn't do it just because I'm getting paid. I don't feel like that's beneficial to anything. You're not a baby machine, rent to womb, or whatever they call it. I see a lot of American surrogates, they get paid $60,000, $120,000 just to get pregnant. Where in Canada, we don't do that.
In neighboring US, surrogates get paid a fee. Here, they do get some money, but only for expenses.
So in your contracts, you set out a certain amount of dollars per month that you're allowed to reimburse. You need to have a receipt for everything. So stuff like food, meds, because I was really sick, they paid for lost wages, stuff like that. But it's only for me, so it's not for my family. It's anything that I would incur.
Canada's altruistic model makes it more ethically acceptable for some. But there are a host of critics around the world clamoring to regulate or even ban surrogacy.
In some ways, I think comparing surrogacy and sex work is appropriate insofar as you have two forms of embodied labor that people are selling.
Katie Fulfer is a professor at the University of Waterloo in Ontario who has been studying surrogacy in Canada.
Just because we have unpaid surrogacy doesn't mean there's no exploitation. A surrogate might be treated as valuable more for what she's doing for the intended parents than she is for being a unique person.
Even within an altruistic model, surrogacy is an expensive business for intended parents that may end up spending up to $75,000. Surrogates may only get reimbursed for expenses, while everybody else gets paid a fee.
In Canada, fertility is a for-profit industry, so doctors are being paid, lawyers are being paid, agents are being paid. Why isn't the surrogate being paid?
There's a big push to change the current Canadian legislation in order to allow surrogates to receive some money without having to present receipts in exchange. But for surrogates like Marisa, their right to decide is their best response to criticism.
I live in a very small town, so I received a lot of negatives. You know, how could you give up that baby? You're giving up your life for your family life. And it's 9 months. I don't have to worry about my period. Yay. I don't have to worry about getting pregnant because I'm already pregnant for someone else. And essentially just telling people, it's your body, it's your choice. There shouldn't be anyone that dictates what you do to your body. You know, if you want to do it, you need to do it for yourself and not let anyone else tell you what to do, essentially. Your body, your choice.
Marisa Mazel, a Canadian surrogate, ending that report by Valeria Parasso. It's been compared to the Tom Hanks comedy The Terminal, but for the Syrian refugee Hassan al-Kontar, it was no laughing matter, stuck for more than 7 months in an airport terminal in Malaysia. His plight gained worldwide attention after he began posting video updates from Kuala Lumpur Airport.
Generally, I'm an optimistic person, which has helped me fight depression. At first, I was angry at everyone until I realized those countries are not rejecting me for personal reasons. They are rejecting me because I am a Syrian. I am a part of the Syrian refugee tragedy started in 2011.
Well, now he has arrived in Canada, where he's been given asylum. Celia Hatton told me more about his story.
Well, Hassan al-Kontar was working in the United Arab Emirates when war first broke out in Syria. He was an insurance manager, and he didn't want to go back to Syria. He's a member of the Druze religious minority. He said he would face persecution if he returned to Syria, and also he's a pacifist. He didn't want to be drafted into the military there. So he did as much as he could to stay in the UAE until his work visa ran out. And then the UAE deported him to Malaysia because that's a country that accepts Syrians without needing a visa. He stayed there for as long as he could. He then tried to board a plane to go to Turkey, and he was denied boarding. And he decided he had no other option other than to remain in the small airport corridor where he was standing trying to get onto a flight. And he stayed there for 7 months.
And briefly, do we know how he lived there?
Yeah, he relied on the goodwill, basically, of flight attendants because it was a part of the airport that didn't have any restaurants. So he slept on the floor on a blanket that was given to him also by flight attendants, and they would bring him leftover plane food from the airplanes. Once in a while, they'd smuggle him some McDonald's or some coffee. He posted a lot of online videos, and he attracted the attention of one woman in Canada named Laurie Cooper, and she's basically devoted the past few years of her life to bringing over Syrian asylum seekers, Syrian refugees, to Canada. Canada has a rule that if private donations, private citizens can kind of cobble together bids to bring over asylum seekers. And so that's what she did. She got together $14,000 and sponsored Hassan al-Khantar. He was almost deported. He was put in a detention centre, almost sent back to Syria, but at the last minute, he arrived in Canada.
Celia Hatton. And still to come in this podcast.
Minu hibilta kama kadrea nashata.
Umishama inala makale berish salak.
An ancient language to tell one of the world's oldest stories of revenge. Russia has gone on the propaganda offensive after seizing 3 Ukrainian ships and their crew in waters near the annexed territory of Crimea on Sunday. It's published recordings of what the Russians say are confessions by the captured Ukrainian sailors. Ukraine has declared martial law in some areas it says are under threat of a Russian invasion. There have been calls for calm from some countries, while other nations are threatening new sanctions on Russia. So what's the view of NATO? Its Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg spoke to my colleague James Menendez.
What we see now is very serious because we have seen that Russia has used military force in a direct way against Ukrainian naval vessels and captured ships and also seized or captured many sailors or naval personnel. And therefore we call on Russia to immediately release the personnel and the ships and allow free access for Ukrainian ships through the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait.
Is NATO prepared to get actively involved in this?
Ukraine is a close partner of NATO. Ukraine is not a member, but we provide strong support to Ukraine. We help to modernize and strengthen their armed forces. We also work with their naval forces. And of course, all NATO allies have implemented economic sanctions against Russia because of its aggressive actions against Ukraine, illegally annexing Crimea and destabilizing eastern Ukraine. And I think what we have seen, what we saw yesterday, is a reminder of the fact that it's actually a war going on in Ukraine, and this war has been going on for 4 years, and therefore NATO provide political and practical support for Ukraine and support Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty.
What does that practical support mean in practice?
It means training, help to modernize their armed forces, including command and control, cyber, but also we work together with them when it comes to strengthening their naval capacities. Next week we'll have a meeting with the Ukrainian foreign minister here in Brussels, and among the issues we'll discuss there is also the security situation in the Black Sea. Then, of course, we have increased NATO presence in the Black Sea region with more troops on the ground, but also with air policing and also stepped up our naval presence. We have 3 littoral states around the Black Sea, Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria, and then 2 close partners, Ukraine and Georgia, and we are working closely with all of them to address the increased Russian presence in the Black Sea region.
NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg. The martial law in Ukraine will come into force on Wednesday, so what difference will it make to people there? Jonah Fisher is our Kiev correspondent.
It's becoming apparent that on a practical level, it may not make very much of a difference whatsoever. This is already a heavily watered down version of martial law. Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko had wanted 60 days of martial law across the entire country. He encountered some pretty serious resistance in Parliament. In the end, they've just got it in these limited number of regions. And indeed, it's unclear what will actually change in those areas apart from perhaps some heightened security. So, yes, martial law will come into force on Wednesday in all these key areas. There are plenty of cynics here who say that President Poroshenko is being opportunistic. There is an election due to take place here in March. At present, President Poroshenko is doing very badly in the opinion polls. He's only got about 8%, which is potentially disastrous. So there are certainly people here who look at this, look at the possibility of rallying round the president in some sort of confrontation with Russia and see a political motive there linked to the upcoming election.
Jonah Fisher in Kiev. President Trump has rejected a US government report saying the cost of climate change will run into billions of dollars by the end of the century. He told reporters outside the White House he didn't accept there would be more intense storms, droughts and wildfires.
I don't believe it. No, I don't believe it. And here's the other thing. You're going to have China and Japan and all of Asia and all of these other countries, addresses our country. Right now, we're at the cleanest we've ever been.
President Trump speaking on Monday afternoon before travelling to Mississippi to support the Republican candidate in the final undecided Senate race. Our correspondent Chris Buckler is on the campaign trail. He told my colleague Emilio Sampedro more about Mr. Trump's reaction to the fourth National Climate Assessment Report.
This National Climate Assessment, Emilio, is something that is very comprehensive. It involves many government departments. It is something that has taken a lot of time and a lot of money. But Donald Trump's response has been to say that very simply he doesn't believe it. He says that he has read some of the report, which, as you mentioned, does warn about the dangers of climate change, the effect on the economy, the effect on crops being grown. And of course, it even talks about the climate causing problems as far as wildfires are concerned, which we've seen in California so recently. But certainly Donald Trump seems to be saying that America is not the problem here. He seems to say that other countries need to be taken into account, that they are dirtier countries. And of course, his policies have very much pushed fossil fuels. At rally after rally, we've seen him talk about beautiful, clean coal, for example. He doesn't want to seem to listen to the message, even when it comes from his own government.
And back in Mississippi, where you are, why has such a safe Republican seat become such a challenge for President Trump, and he's had to visit it at the last minute ahead of this runoff election?
Yeah, President Trump not just holding one rally in Mississippi on the eve of this election, but in fact holding two. And as you mentioned, the Republicans would have thought that this was a safe Senate seat. But everything has changed in this election because of some comments that have been made by Cindy Hyde-Smith, who is the Republican candidate. At one stage, she said to a supporter, which was caught on camera and caught on audio, in which she said that if he was to hold a public hanging, that she would be in the front row. Now, in a state that has a history of racial violence, has a history of lynchings, for example, that has caused a great deal of concern and all of a sudden made this a much closer race. In fact, her opponent, the Democratic candidate, Mike Espy, is an African-American, and it has added a sense that the race has become a big issue in this battle for the election. She does now apologise for those comments, although she says her words have been twisted. But it makes it an interesting election, and certainly Donald Trump wants to get every Senate seat he can. He has a majority already, but the greater amount of majority he has, the better it is for him going forward.
Chris Buckler in Mississippi. Now to the vast open spaces of Australia, where a pilot of a cargo plane apparently fell asleep and missed his destination by nearly 50 kilometres. He was flying from Devonport to King Island in Tasmania, but managed to wake up and land safely. However, air traffic authorities are investigating. Neil Hansford is an aviation expert in Sydney. So how could this have happened?
Well, basically what will happen on a long flight like this, which was 250 kilometres, some of the generally older pilots will set the aircraft up on the autopilot and have an alarm clock or something similar, which will wake them up when they're due. And they're not going into a dead sleep. It's a bit of a micro sleep, a nano nap, and that's generally what will happen. In this case, the pilot is overflown by 46 kilometres, and we still don't know from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau what woke the pilot up. But the pilot then did a return and landed safely at King Island. And we don't actually know that it was a freight flight, but we would think because it was a single-handed flight, there was no passengers, that's what it was.
He did land safely and all's well that ends well and so on, but it doesn't always end that way. There have been instances, I think, of people who've fallen asleep and then crashed.
Yeah, well, I like to say I know from my personal circumstances that there was a situation of a 26,000-hour pilot, very experienced, flying in difficult conditions in New Guinea, flew from Brisbane to Rockhampton, was having a nano nap, didn't know the particular aircraft very well, so didn't realise that he had to switch the auxiliary tank over, and the aircraft obviously then continued once the fuel ran out to glide down and had to hit the trees, and the pilot was regrettably deceased.
For those listening who are obviously concerned about this, I mean, could this happen on a passenger flight, or is that much more likely because you've got more people in the cockpit?
This can only really happen when it's a single pilot operation over a long distance with an aircraft that's relatively slow by jet standards. And it's also in an area where there's not a lot of radio traffic, because with the headphones, there's always so much traffic going on, like anywhere over Europe, there's traffic going on. So there's so much happening that you'd be unlikely to have it. But you can get whole areas of Australia which are just like a black hole that you won't hear from anybody for maybe half an hour or similar. And so it's the tyranny of distance in Africa and continents like Australia and South America. It's not an occurrence you're likely to find in Europe.
Aviation expert Neil Hansford talking to James Menendez. One of the world's oldest stories, which was found carved into a clay tablet in Turkey, has been made into a film for the first time. It's a classic tale of revenge involving a man and his goat. This report from Caroline Hawley.
Recognise this? Umishama in Ala Makale. Berish Salaku.
It's a language that hasn't been spoken for 2,000 years, but Babylonian is back. At least it is at Cambridge University, where an unusual academic exercise has led to what's being billed as the world's first film in Babylonian. It's described as a violent but comic story of revenge, based on a poem found on a clay tablet at an archaeological site in southeastern Turkey. The academic behind the project, Dr. Martin Worthington, hopes the film, to be published online, will open up what he calls a fascinating ancient world to a broader audience. And in case you're worried about your Babylonian, there will be subtitles.
Caroline Hawley reporting. Finally, just time to tell you about another of our podcasts, The Business Daily with Rob Young.
All this week, we're examining the health of the European Union as the bloc prepares to lose the UK as a member. On Monday, we heard from Germany. Today, we're in France, a country rocked by recent protests against President Macron's economic reforms. We've been talking to businesses, to workers, to the unemployed, asking why they don't like his plans, but also looking at whether his lack of support at home among some people could mean he struggles to persuade the rest of Europe to back his plans to reform the European Union into a multi-speed continent. Download Business Daily from wherever you usually get your podcasts.
Rob Young on the road with Business Daily. And that's all from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on the podcast or anything in it, send an email to globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Oliver Conway. Until next time, goodbye.